Hello, everyone. I'm Apoorva Mandavilli, Science and Global Health Reporter for the New York Times. Welcome to Ending the COVID-19 Pandemic, a GZERO Media livestream in partnership with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Eurasia Group. First, a quick word on what you'll see in the next hour. We're going to talk about where things really stand on vaccine development, the political and economic challenges of distribution, and what societies need to be focused on until vaccines arrive in large scale. And we'll feature some audience polling that you can participate in during our program. If you're watching on GZERO Media site right now, you'll see a chat window to the right of the video screen on a desktop or below the player on a mobile device. You can sign in using Vimeo, Facebook, or as a guest. Once signed in, you'll see the poll window with a question and a few possible responses to choose from. Cast your vote and keep an eye out for the results during our discussion. Let's get started. My first guest is Lynda Stuart, Deputy Director, Vaccines and Human Immunobiology at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome, Lynda.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Lynda, let's start with the very premise of the show, ending the pandemic. How close are we to that goal, and what will that involve?
So this is, of course, the billion-dollar question, and sadly, the answer to it is I don't know. I think there are many variables. When will we have widespread testing? When will we have treatments? And when will we have a widely deployable vaccine? But the main reason I don't know is it really will come down to human behavior and down to our actions. Once we have all these tools, if we do need to use them wisely, or if we don't, that could prolong the pandemic. And to really end the pandemic, we need to get this under control globally, or it will just continue to flare up. I do think for some high-income countries, we may get back to some level of normalcy towards the end of next year. But for a global community, I think we're talking 3 or 4 years.
Well, about vaccines specifically, do you think too much hope and emphasis has been placed on vaccines?
No, actually, I think this is appropriate. I do think vaccines are the key step. But what we often say is vaccines don't save lives, it's the immunizations that save lives. And what we mean by that is that we have to both develop the vaccine and also then get it out to people and get them immunized. Although additional measures will be important and, combining, vaccines with non-pharmacological interventions such as masks and social distancing will be even more efficacious. But I think the vaccine is the key thing to turn it around. Yes, I think there are reasons to be hopeful.
Okay, well, let's break down exactly where we are with vaccines. There are at least 42 candidates in clinical trials on humans and dozens more in various phases of trials. First, can you explain to our viewers what each phase of vaccine development entails?
Yeah, I mean, just to put this in context, normally it takes about 15 years to get from the beginning to the end of a vaccine. And the fastest it's been done is 4 years. So the reason for that is there are multiple stages. There's the research phase, which can take 3 or 5 years, and that's really looking for a vaccine that works. And in some cases, for an HIV vaccine, as an example, we've never got out of that research stage. There's phase 1 safety, where you look to see it's safe and it does induce an immune response. Phase 2 is in the target population and looking for the right dose. And then phase 3 are these large studies, which are really looking at widespread safety and efficacy. And then after that, the vaccine has to go through a process of approval and licensure. But I think the piece of the puzzle that we often don't think about is the manufacturing. The manufacturing is very expensive, very technically tricky to build the factories that make the vaccines. And we will normally wait for the vaccine to be shown to work before we jump into that. And that's the thing that we're doing at risk here in building those factories before we even know the vaccines are working.
And where do you think researchers are seeing the greatest signs of hope? What specific trials and where?
I think we're hopeful because we've moved so quickly through the first phases of that. We're already seeing things in phase 3. That's remarkable. And then everything or many of the things in phase 3 have been through stringent testing in animal models and have been shown to be protective. And we know that many of them elicit immune responses, or most of them elicit immune responses in humans. So none of that should be taken for granted. Those things are not a given, and they can often go wrong in the early stages. So I think we should feel hopeful because of that, but we do really need to wait for the phase 3 study results.
Let's talk a bit about who's being included in these trials and who's being left out. Certain populations, demographics, children, pregnant women, how does that affect the potential results?
Yeah, I mean, these are very big trials, and they have to be big because they're really chasing the epidemiology, chasing the disease, which you see comes and goes. And there are 30,000 patient or more in the US, mostly. They're trying to get to older people to show that their immune response is okay. I mean, lots of vaccines have a very blunted response in the elderly, so that's important. But the demographics haven't been optimal. So, most clinical trials or many clinical trials under recruit women. They often don't have good representation from underrepresented or marginalized populations. And particularly in this case, where those are the populations where we really are most impacted and most likely to die from the vaccines, this is very important. We have seen some companies slow down deliberately to try and expand recruitment to get better representation in those populations so they can really know they work. And then globally, I think, it's also important to test these in different geographies. There are a number of vaccines that we've seen that don't perform well when you take them into low and middle income settings, such as the rotavirus vaccine. And we are trying to do that. We're funding some studies in Africa to look at this, especially to evaluate the performance in HIV positive individuals, as an example.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that the phase 3 trials and the size of those trials is really important for determining safety in large numbers as well. But both China and Russia have approved vaccines without waiting for completion of phase 3 trials. What does that mean?
It's hard to say what it means. I think personally, I think it reveals how desperate we all are to find a solution and to get back to normalcy. It's really not optimal. If something bad happens in one of those vaccine trials, even if it's completely unrelated to any of the other trials or any of the other vaccine candidate, it'll really cause a lot of concern, and it could really set us all back a long way. So, it's not optimal.
Mm-hmm. And here in the US, there's a battle going on between the White House and the FDA on when and how to approve a vaccine and when and how to roll one out. Can you comment on that a bit?
Yeah, I think, as far as approval, I think as we've just discussed, I think we're all very impatient to get a solution, and the White House is no different. I do, however, think the sanctity of the FDA and the FDA process is absolutely vital, vital for trust, vital, scientifically. And we must let them go through their diligence to confirm the vaccine is both safe and efficacious. And this isn't something we should compromise on. And it's really something that politicians shouldn't be involved in. As far as rolling things out, even if we do have a vaccine and it's declared to work well, rolling it out at a population level is a massive logistical challenge. In the US, we do not do mass vaccine campaigns in this country. This is an example where poorer countries may actually do better because they're more used to doing vaccine campaigns. But here in the US, there's going to be a reliance on a public health infrastructure that's been woefully underfunded, and I'm just not sure how well it will go. And I think the other piece of this is going to be how we prioritize that rollout and making sure the vaccines get to those who need it most, such as healthcare workers or these marginalized populations that are dying at much higher numbers. They're not at the back of the line. And, it's hard to, what we don't want is, a sort of more capitalist view where the person who can pay gets the vaccine first. And so I think those are two pieces of tension between the White House, perhaps, and the FDA and public health communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, it's time for the first viewer poll, which is about this very subject. Here's the question. How comfortable would you be receiving a government-approved COVID vaccine when it is available? A, very comfortable, B, somewhat comfortable, and C, not at all comfortable? And Lynda, while we give people time to answer that question, let's talk about that. To what extent do you think the politicization of vaccine, I cannot seem to say that word, will affect people's trust in its efficacy?
I think the politicization of vaccines is an absolute tragedy. I mean, vaccine hesitancy at the best of times is a growing issue in the US and around the world. And politicizing it just makes it worse. It's remarkable for somebody who's worked in vaccines for years, particularly to see this happen at such a critical moment in history, when that is the last thing that we need. I will say that I do think the politicians should probably step out of the way and let the scientists and the public health physicians do the work. And the politicians should be taking a back seat and empowering those who are more technical and who do this for a living to really drive this. So it is really a great shame.
Lynda, a recent Gallup poll found that a third of Americans would not get the vaccine, even if it were FDA approved. Why do you think that is?
I think this comes down to two main problems. I think there's a lack of trust and a lack of clarity or some ignorance around why they need the vaccine. So people don't trust the government-sponsored efforts because they worry that there are ulterior motives, and this is why letting the FDA get on with it is important. I think this is particularly important because of the proximity to the elections. This is something that is concerning people. And then I think the other reason is that people don't necessarily understand whether they are at risk. I think this insane meme that is still going around that this is just like a bad flu, and is really quite sad. And people don't really see themselves necessarily being at high risk. But as an example, obesity is a major risk factor, and much of the US is obese. So, many people are simply in denial that they need it. So it's hard to comprehend this when a million people have died. We just passed that grim milestone. It's not just made up, but I think a clear and consistent messaging would really help here.
Mm-hmm. And the numbers of people who say they won't get it are actually slightly higher among non-white Americans who tend to be more vulnerable to the virus. Let's unpack that.
Yeah, I think this is a very complicated question. I think it is to do with trust, and you suddenly these communities are quite reasonably anxious about anything that's coming from the government. So it's a trust problem.
Okay, well, let's see how people responded to our poll. 47% said they would be very comfortable getting a vaccine. 41% said they would be somewhat comfortable, and 11% said not at all. Now, I'm actually a little bit surprised by that result. Lynda, what do you think?
I think you're probably polling a sort of unique demographics of the population. The very fact that they're listening to this conversation suggests that they're enlightened to a certain degree. But I think it would be really nice if it was 80% were confident that they would take it. But yeah. I know this isn't what we're seeing in general polls, which are less than 50% now. So,
Well, let's get to two viewer questions along vaccine lines. Philip F. in the United States asks, will a vaccine produce permanent immunity? And Janie G. in the Netherlands asks, will we need more than one injection of the vaccine for complete protection?
Yeah, so those are good questions. We don't know whether there'll be complete immunity, and we don't know whether we will need more than one injection. So, there are a couple of single-dose vaccines out there, and but generally you need a prime and a boost, so you need two doses. And we also don't know how long they last for. And a lot of this is going to really depend on some features around whether they block transmission and they break the cycle. And so if you have enough vaccinated people, whether this dies out or whether this stays with us. So it's very hard at this point until we see some of these results to know what the vaccine is actually going to look like.
Lynda, Stuart, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Vaccine development is only part of the battle. Next, we're going to talk about politics and economics of distribution, competition, cooperation, and everything in between. I'll be joined by Mark Suzman, CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Rohitesh Dhawan, Managing Director, Energy, Climate and Resources, Eurasia Group, and Gayle E. Smith, President and CEO, One Campaign, and former administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Welcome to you all. Mark, how do we even begin to discuss distribution of vaccines in this case? What for you are the main questions that need to be addressed?
Well, what we've got to do is realize that this is an unprecedented challenge globally, that we've never actually tried to vaccinate most of the entire planet. That requires 7 billion vaccines, or as Lynda just said, if you need 2 doses, 14 billion vaccines. So it's an unprecedented challenge in terms of manufacturing and distribution. But what we also need is to make sure it's affordable and equitably distributed. That means not just in rich countries alone, where there's the challenge that many rich countries have been buying up vaccine supply. And that's why we and others have been trying to participate in broader efforts to say we should both have a sort of prioritization of who gets the vaccines first, including high-risk groups and healthcare workers. We need to put a premium on affordability, and we need to be manufacturing now multiple vaccine candidates at the same time so they're ready to distribute as and when we get the regulatory approval.
Ro, let's talk about the World Health Organization's COVAX facility. Dozens of nations have already signed on. What is it? How does it work? And what does it mean that the 2 largest economies, the US and China, are not participating?
Apoorva, the COVAX system is trying to do exactly what Mark just said, which is to try and democratize access to the vaccines. I think of it a bit like a global mutual fund for vaccine development, where the world pools its resources together, backs a set of vaccines. In this case, there are 9 vaccines in play, and then ensures that when the results are available, that those results are made available to everybody with equality as the guiding principle. So far, 170 countries have come together to be part of COVAX. It's grown even past the deadline in September for countries to sign up. But as you point out, very notably missing are both the US and China. For different reasons, I would say. In the China case, China has continued to signal quite positive signals about potentially joining COVAX and certainly supporting it. In the case of the United States, it's been a clear decision that the ability for the United States to strike bilateral deals for access to the vaccine is a higher priority in terms of how the country will progress. Many of us have connections to South Africa, and there's a saying in South Africa that says, if you want to go far, go together. If you want to go fast, go alone. Well, certainly the political momentum for the United States is to go fast, and that's why we're seeing the United States go fast. But for 170 countries, COVAX represents an opportunity to go together.
That's a really interesting saying, very apt for the moment. Let's pause for a moment to ask our viewers another question. If your country develops a vaccine, should it be shared globally before all of its citizens are vaccinated? A, yes. B, no. While we wait for their answer, let's continue. Gayle, what's the state of play for middle income and least developed nations in this discussion?
Well, this is the big challenge because it's those countries that have the least ability to engage in the kinds of deals that can procure the vaccines that are needed, which is why the initiative that's been described here, whether it's COVAX or the work that Mark laid out, is both about accelerating the distribution of the vaccine, but also ensuring greater and equitable coverage. And the thing that's really important here, it's the right thing to do. It is more equitable, but it's also scientifically smart. The epidemiology makes clear that if we distribute vaccines in a certain way, we can shorten the lifespan of this pandemic. If we don't, and we see what's happened typically, which is that it takes on average 7 years for a vaccine available in wealthy countries to be available in lower and middle income countries, we're going to extend the lifespan of the pandemic. So they are trying to get in the queue. They are joining COVAX. They're very interested. They're trying to put resources on the table. But we can't afford to repeat what's happened in the past, which is a real inequity that, again, will extend the life of the pandemic.
To your point, it's estimated that 12 million Africans died waiting for effective HIV/AIDS therapies. How do we ensure a similar kind of inequality doesn't develop here?
Well, I think we got to do a few things. I think it's really, really important to act in support of this initiative to get equitable coverage. I think it's also important that there be transparency so that citizens around the world know, both to the points we heard earlier, the facts about how this works. You know, epidemiology is a great thing. It's scientific fact, and you can actually map out how this can work and what will make a difference. And I think, frankly, we need to put pressure on our leaders and provide incentives where those are appropriate. We're going to launch something called the Vaccine Access Test to rate governments and companies on whether or not their actions contribute to global equity. But I think we've got to keep the public pressure on, quite frankly, based less on the normal conventional politics and more on the fact that our expectation is that leaders will come together to shorten the lifespan of this pandemic and not extend it. And if you want to do that, then you've got to include the whole planet in the exercise.
Well, here's a viewer question on a related note. Ismail in Kenya writes, how do we ensure that developing countries get their shares of an effective vaccine once approved?
Well, I
Mark,
imagine Mark or others, or go ahead.
Yeah, well, partly that is exactly what the COVAX facility is intended to try and do. So it's, as we're saying, it's kind of like a pooled risk mutual fund, which poor countries and rich countries are able to join together. And that then you have a kind of mechanism that both maximizes the procurement so that there'll be a certain degree of proportion given to all participating countries for around, say, 20% of their population. And that would allow Kenya to get access at around the same time as the United Kingdom or Canada or other participating countries. So that's why we think that's so important. And as Gayle said, you know, we did some modeling as the Gates Foundation in our annual Goalkeepers report, which just came out, which looks at progress towards improvement in the Sustainable Development Goals, and normally is a very good news report that tells you how much progress is happening that people don't realize about. And this year was a bad news report about how big some of the setbacks were, including massive setbacks on vaccines. But that report also did a modeling exercise, and the modeling exercise was trying to say what would be the effect on the virus if you took the first 2 billion doses and you gave them exclusively to high-income countries, or you distributed them more equitably. And the modeling showed clearly you would have twice as many deaths if you did it exclusively to the high-income countries and delayed it. So from a pure epidemiological, a moral argument, all of these, I think the world really needs to think about how we address this together to make sure that that lag that you talked about from HIV does not happen in the case of COVID vaccines, and indeed other COVID treatments like diagnostics and therapeutics.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's also a geopolitical competition playing out here. We think of decoupling, the Chinese and US systems and economies growing further apart intentionally. China and the US are both trying to go it alone here. What happens if China gets to an effective vaccine first? They're already testing in Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey. Will those nations get first dibs on the finished product?
Apoorva, they likely will. And there are two main reasons for it. As Lynda explained, the task of actually producing and getting the vaccines out is a mammoth task. And even though China is a manufacturing superpower, it has had to go out and seek external partners with which to both test and manufacture the vaccine. So in addition to Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, the list is long. The United Arab Emirates, the Saudi Arabians, Peru, Chile, Pakistan. There's a set of countries that China has built partnerships with for testing and manufacturing the vaccine. And the agreements are, of course, to give those countries some portion of the vaccines that are thus developed, but also for China to have access to the spoils of the work. Now, it is, of course, an awkward but an unfortunate reality that is a way for countries to exert soft power. And in a G0 world, where, as you say, the United States and China are essentially fighting for primacy geopolitically, this will be a dynamic that we have to live with. And then when you get to what Lynda explained to us about how there are some vaccines which are pursuing a one-dose approach versus a two-dose approach, and some vaccines that don't need to be frozen, they just need to be chilled, those types of vaccines, which are simpler to handle, will naturally be more attractive to countries that have less well-developed healthcare infrastructures. And so once again, that's where we will see natural geopolitical alliances that in some cases reinforce existing alliances, and in other cases will create new ones.
Let's check in on that poll that we asked a few minutes ago. The question was, if your country develops a vaccine, should it be shared globally before all of its citizens are vaccinated? And the results are in, says 90% said yes and 10% said no. This is an unusually altruistic group we have here. Panelists, any reactions and comments?
Well, clearly they've all been well educated by reading the Eurasia reports and studying the goalkeepers reports. But that's great to see.
It's also smart. I mean, it's altruistic, but it's the smart solution and the fastest way to shorten the lifespan of the pandemic. So I would score points for altruism and brains.
Let's talk a little bit about all the other implications: trade, travel, the privilege that could come with immunity that will potentially only come at a price. I mean, early in the pandemic, we talked about immunity passports. What will that look like for the world? Ro, do you want to take a shot at this one?
Sure. Look, the most immediate implication that one would see in that world is, I suppose, travel corridors, places where there are, the disease is under control, not just through vaccines, but other mechanisms as well, will probably end up getting back to some sense of normalcy before others. That will exacerbate existing inequalities. What we'll also see likely is, particularly in the emerging markets, economies that are more vulnerable to tourism or the external economy are going to suffer more. So if you take two economies in Asia, for instance, you would expect to see Thailand much more vulnerable to, say, Indonesia, where Indonesia has an economy that is much less dependent externally, has a much stronger domestic footprint. So, we'll see those types of divisions get exacerbated, and it's going to be it will lead to some important both human issues, but also broader geopolitical questions that flow from it.
For those of you who've just joined us, this is Ending the COVID-19 Pandemic. We're talking about vaccine development, distribution, and now what happens while we wait for that vaccine to arrive. First, here's a message from Melinda Gates on the impact the pandemic is having on women.
COVID-19 began as a medical emergency, but it didn't stop there. The pandemic has led to the greatest global economic crisis since the Great Depression. And this crisis is magnifying inequality. Early estimates suggest that women are nearly twice as likely to lose their jobs as men. And low-income women are the most at risk. If we empower women with measures like cash transfers, addressing unpaid care, and other policies, then we could create as many as 230 million new jobs. So as the world confronts a long-term global economic recovery, one solution must be at the center: making sure women have economic power.
Gayle, before we discuss what life will be like until the vaccine, let's discuss what life is like right now for vulnerable populations around the world and how this pandemic has exacerbated that. Thoughts?
Well, Melinda's exactly right. And we've seen this in communities, in countries, and between countries, that those who have the least ability to withstand a shock of the scale of this pandemic are the ones that suffer the most extensively. So that we are seeing the first increase in extreme poverty in almost 20 years. We are seeing at serious risk all of those things that a good goalkeeper's report always reports progress on. So in food security, in education, in other areas of healthcare. I think in terms of the previous discussion about if we don't get it right, if we proceed in a way that cements those inequalities into the global system by getting it wrong on the vaccine and therapeutics front, we are going to see entire countries start to default. It's estimated that as many as 30 countries could go into default in the short to medium term. Now, any one of those collapsing may not have a ripple effect on the global economy, but when we start seeing that scale of economic disruption, it will have an impact. So the tragic irony here, but it's also the opportunity, is that with investments now in vaccines and vaccine availability and access everywhere, and in shoring up the progress that's been made over the last 25 years, we will spend a lot less money, provide the world with much more confidence that it is a fair place to live, and in the pandemic. So it's cost effective, the return on investment is tremendous. I think the challenge is persuading enough leaders around the world to come together and get it done.
We actually have some projections that we can look at on global poverty. Let's take a look at this chart compared to the two previous years. You don't have to be a mathematician to figure out what this means. Mark, how big a setback has the pandemic caused to efforts to eradicate global poverty?
Well, huge. You just heard Gayle say, I mean, this is the greatest success story of the last 20 years has been the more than halving of extreme poverty globally. We've seen steady declines of hundreds of millions of people being lifted out of poverty over 2 decades. And now we're seeing a dramatic reversal with at least, the current projections are 37 million people thrown back into extreme poverty, an increase, and potentially much larger numbers in the future if we don't address that. And as Gayle also points out, it's the knock-on effects, especially for the poorest countries, are so profound. The wider vaccine coverage, right? More people risk dying of measles, or we need to restart the polio campaigns to complete the eradication of polio, which this year we had a success story that Africa eliminated wild polio virus and it's just left in Asia. But all of these are being put at serious risk. And that's again why you need some of that equitable distribution, not just for government. You can't shut down any economy indefinitely. And certainly in poor countries, you want, say, healthcare workers to be back at their posts, able to treat the vast range of other diseases. We know, for example, when the Ebola crisis happened in West Africa, there were more excess deaths that came from complications in child mortality and maternal mortality because people weren't able to do normal health-seeking behavior. And we're worried similar things will happen with COVID. So, this is a widespread challenge where we need to do a both and. Address the current issues, try and minimize the damage, but then really look, as Melinda said in that video, are there opportunities that we can both address deep inequities like gender and through tools like the digital transfers, but use that as platforms so that in the coming years we can actually accelerate the narrowing of those equity gaps on gender, on other health inequalities, etc. So I think there is a potential silver lining.
That's good to hear. Ro, what are the implications geopolitically for developing nations?
Well, we were just building on what Gayle was saying about countries that may face defaults. I think there are sets of countries that I would label at the moment pre-crisis who are in danger of tipping over into crisis as a result of what we're living through. And that's, of course, as a result of the health impact first and foremost, but also as a result of the economic impact from the shutdowns. Take a country like Iraq, for instance, which I would say would be pre-crisis in my world, my sort of geopolitical world right now. 90% of Iraq's revenue is oil dependent, and that's already halved this year. The impact of that for populations in Iraq, and then you think about the stability of the region, are deeply significant. And we can run down the list of other pre-crisis states across the Middle East, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa. for whom this may well be the thing that tips from pre-crisis into crisis. So I think for the emerging markets, Apoorva, that would be the one really big geopolitical trend that I see coming.
So, Gayle, what needs to be done to ensure progress isn't eroded in the face of the pandemic?
Well, I think there are a few things. I think achieving more progress, and look, the goals are ambitious in terms of the amount of money that needs to be mobilized to ensure equitable vaccine coverage. But that's really number one. I think the second is to address the economic crisis affecting low-income countries. They've received the kind of shock we've seen in the US and Europe, and look what we've done. We've put literally trillions of dollars on the table and broken every rule on the book to shore up our own economies. Some of that can be done for low-income countries by putting a moratorium on their debt service payments, by issuing what are called special drawing rights, a basket of currencies from the IMF that will provide some liquidity and stabilize so that the gains that Mark was describing aren't lost. It would be a shame to see those eroded. I think the third thing is that we need to see countries maintain and really extend their commitments to development more broadly. I mean, Melinda made a very powerful point that there is a huge opportunity here, not solely to address the inequities that have been exposed so dramatically so that we can get back to the status quo, but to take that exposure as an opportunity and indeed, I would say a necessity to build back in a way that we surpass the status quo and get to the point where we're increasing jobs, decreasing poverty. But it takes movement on all of those fronts. And I think it takes a level of global cooperation that has been a little absent over the last couple of years. I'm very struck in the discussions of China. It wasn't that long ago that the US and China cooperated very ably on something like Ebola. So it's also figuring out where we can forge cooperation, even in the small places, to get this started, because it cannot be done by just a handful of countries.
I'd like to ask each of you to answer a question that I think haunts all of us. What does life look like globally if vaccine isn't a reality anytime soon, or simply isn't the silver bullet we want it to be?
We're known at the Gates Foundation for being impatient optimists. I will say, as you heard from Lynda at the start, that we do believe the prognosis for a vaccine is relatively good, and there are multiple vaccines. And even if the first wave aren't fully effective or require a couple of doses, we're taking enough shots on goal, and we're being smart enough that we're cautiously confident some combination of the vaccines online will help. But even if they don't or they're delayed, there are other important advances taking place. In therapeutics, we're actually seeing some really good advances on monoclonal antibodies, which are a sort of highly advanced technique, but there are a couple of promising things which could actually make sure that if you get ill, you don't get very sick and die. Not insured, but actually do. Now, those are kind of expensive, they're difficult to distribute, but we can constantly look for other tools and techniques. Can you get better testing and treatment? Can you get sort of smarter uses of sort of mask wearing and the wider sort of social and economic norms that minimize the diffusion of the virus while sort of maximizing the openness of economies? So, it's certainly not the quote unquote back to normal, but I'm not sure there's ever going to be a full back to normal, because I think we're in a post-COVID world is going to look fundamentally different in some important ways. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are positive steps that will allow us to keep addressing the wider sets of challenges and opportunities that Gayle and others have talked about, while confronting the reality of the virus, which we do need to tackle and affects every aspect of all of our lives right now.
I like that note of optimism. Ro?
Well, Apoorva, I think the way I think about it geopolitically is that the future you describe of one where we haven't yet made a breakthrough in vaccines, that future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And what I mean by that is that there are some large emerging markets for whom living with the virus has had to be a de facto strategy because social distancing is often not possible in the lives that people lead in those countries, and lockdowns aren't feasible either. And so I think the experiences of countries like Brazil, India, Nigeria, and several others, I think are a sign of what life will be like until we do have a breakthrough in the vaccines. And Mark gives us some really good reason to be hopeful that even without vaccines, we'll have a way to manage the disease burden. But I think to go into it with our eyes open, that I think these large emerging markets do give us some sign of what this scenario of living with the virus might look like.
Gayle?
On the upside of if we don't have a vaccine, I would very much agree with Mark. I'm optimistic that we will have one, but I think the continued progress on therapeutics is a path that we've got to also be very focused on. As well, and while they are insufficient alone, some of the practices we've had to adopt, mask, social distancing, those are going to have to be a feature of life going forward. And the efficacy of those will depend, I think, again, on the ability of community and political leaders to persuade people and demonstrate the importance, because we've seen in a lot of countries where those have been absolutely instrumental in progress. On the downside, I think there is a real danger, to Rose's point, that there will be a set of countries that are in a state of, quite frankly, perpetual crisis as a result of this. Because when we were discussing earlier, if we have travel corridors, there are countries whose economies will collapse. So I think there is a real danger of that kind of crisis and the instability that comes with it. I would, if I may, end on a note of hope, though, because one of the things I think is very positive in this is, despite all the politics, the geopolitical intrigue, the fight against facts that we have seen tragically as part of this pandemic, we've seen really consistent and robust cooperation among scientists across borders, across communities. I think regardless of what happens, we will see an escalation and deepening of that. And if we don't have a vaccine, it will grow even further. And that's something we've really got to count on, because those are the people, the networks, the data, and the information that's going to give us the answers.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Mark, Gayle, Ro, thank you all so much. I'm Apoorva Mandavilli. Viewers, thank you for watching, and be well.